welcome to Cundall's Earth Day presentation, 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and the theme for this year is climate action, which is appropriate. As a planet, it seems we're coming together during this healthcare emergency, and we need to keep working together to overcome the climate emergency. We mustn't forget the importance of that. My name's Johnny Allen. Thank you, Thomas, for reminding me. I'm a partner at Cundall. I lead the global marketing and BD team. I'm going to be checking the questions as we go through this. So I'm going to hand over to Simon shortly to launch into the presentation, and Simon can introduce himself. We have people on this webinar from across the world, which is great to see. And really, this is a key point with the climate emergency. Just like the world is coming together to fight the coronavirus, we really need to keep that going and work together on climate change, as Simon will address. So without much more from me, Simon, if you want to go to the next slide, I'll just introduce a couple of other things. Cundall are, Simon?
Should have gone.
Yeah, got it. So we're hosting a whole load of webinars over the coming weeks. We do a lot of thought leadership as a business. I'm sure a lot of you would have been to our events in different countries around the world. And we see no reason to stop that. So next Wednesday, we've got a presentation happening. Mike Gosling is speaking about co-working, the evolution of the workplace, which again is particularly relevant at the moment. And then overheating in residential will follow that, and office lighting, health and well-being. We've also run a few already which are recorded that can be shared. So speak to your contacts at Cundall or contact me, and we can share things with you and come and sign up to all of those. And then Simon, the final slide from me. We're also doing some panel discussions, which we're calling an e-event. So again, a sort of relevant thing at the moment. We're finding a lot of our clients coming to us and asking us questions about this. So we thought it would be a useful thing for us with a few of our industry colleagues to talk about. So the first event will be happening in the next couple of weeks in the Middle East, and then there'll be an Asia Pac version and a European version around the same time. So we'll be sending out invites to all of those per region in the next week or so. So please look out for those if you're interested. And then, yes, I've said a few times, but we will be allowing time at the end of this for Q&A. So please get your questions coming in. I'll be monitoring that as we go through the presentation, and then putting those to Simon at the end. We are recording this, and we plan to put the recording on online and share it with all of you afterwards. I think that's about it from me for now. So I'll hand over to Simon to get started.
Thanks, Johnny. As Johnny says, my name's Simon Wyatt. I'm a partner here at Cundall. I lead our sustainability and building physics teams out of our London office. As Johnny says, this is a global event, and Cundall now are a global organisation. We operate in 25 offices around the world with over 1,000 staff, and we see climate change as being a global issue, which is affecting all of our clients. And net zero carbon has really been at the forefront of everyone's agenda for kind of the last 6 months. And it's been interesting to see the different response we've had in different areas of the world, but generally they're all kind of pulling together in the same direction. In terms of services, most of you probably know us as multidisciplinary engineers, offering our core services of building services, civil structures and sustainability. But we also have a host of specialist supporting teams, and with climate change and sustainability, these specialists really help us be at the forefront of our response to sustainability, understanding things like air quality, light pollution, and health and well-being. So we're able to offer all of these services globally and to support our response to climate change. We also work across all sectors, which again gives us insight to what's going on in different areas of the industry, and use the best practice from one sector in other sectors to drive those forward as well. And in terms of climate change, all projects, all developments are really facing this challenge together and are moving forward. At Cundall, we consider ourselves to be leaders in sustainability, and we have a joint focus on people and planet whenever we talk about sustainability. One of the things that we've prided ourselves on over the last kind of 4 or 5 years is a real focus on well-being and people. But to be honest, there's probably been a slight skewing of the focus. There's really been a focus on things like the well building standard over the last 4 or 5 years internationally, whereas the planetary side has probably taken a back seat. We've seen over the last 6 months, especially after Blue Planet and the rise of the issue of single-use plastics, planetary sustainability come back more into the forefront. With COVID-19, we might be seeing it go back towards the health and well-being side and the healthcare, but we really need to keep these two in balance in order to really be designing sustainable built environments and places for people to occupy. So just to give a bit of context where we were with the climate crisis over the last kind of 6 months to a year before we saw the current recent events. So in terms of the climate crisis, as Johnny says, today is World Earth Day, which represents 50 years of World Earth Day. It's also 5 years from the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, as we should all be familiar with now, was when the world leaders came together and agreed that we'd limit climate change to within 2 degrees of global warming, which is a reasonably challenging target, but they also set an aspiration for a 1.5 degree world. Our current trajectory is considerably higher than that. It's around about 3.5 to 4 degrees, and we've already seen 1 degree of climate change. But 5 years on, we've talked a lot about this, but there's been very little action, and a lot of the time has been lost. And our chances of now hitting a 1.5 degree world are generally less than kind of 2%, whereas more likely scenario is around about a 3 degree world. If you take all of the declarations which have been submitted by all the international governments now for their climate reductions, they actually add up to 3.2 degrees, which is well short of our 2 degree target. And that's assuming that 100% of those governments hit those targets. We're just as likely to be moving further afield and moving towards kind of a 5 degree or even potentially a 4 or 5 degree world. So we really need to take severe action in order to hit our climate targets. What's been really interesting though, at the same time, over the last 2 years, we've really started to see the cost of inaction. We're seeing more and more extreme weather events. We've seen a number of tropical storms which have really affected commerce and business. This is Osaka Airport in Japan, which was flooded during a cyclone a few years ago and was re-flooded again during the Rugby World Cup. When an airport goes down, it costs millions of pounds to the economy for every hour that it's out of action. If it's out of action for a day, it's billions of dollars to the economy. And if you think about most airports, they're generally by seas or by rivers and are extreme flood risk. We're also seeing many more events around the world, extreme weather events in the Caribbean over the last couple of years, and in America. Closer in Europe, we've generally seen a lot more flash flooding, heat waves. We saw a significant heat wave globally in 2018, which had a significant death toll. And more recently, we've seen the bush and forest fires in North America, Europe, and extremely in Australia. All of these things are starting to put pressure on our way of life, our economy, and the ecosystems that we use to support our way of life. So we're really starting to see what the impact of climate change is. This has kind of caused a kind of groundswell. We've seen a lot of youth movement and protests. Started really a couple of years ago by Greta Thunberg when she sat outside the Swedish Parliament on her own to strike, starting the Fridays for Future movement. And then we've seen Extinction Rebellion and other movements really push the agenda in around the world, trying to create action from their governments. The UK government, for one, took action last year when it amended the Climate Change Act to set a new target to be carbon neutral by 2050 compared to their previous target of 80% reduction. That was a real significant change in the industry because the market, because everything that was deemed to be too difficult, like aviation or existing buildings, were generally said, oh, they're too difficult to decarbonize, we'll leave those in the 20%. And if you actually added up everything that was hiding in that 20%, it probably came to 30 or even higher than 30%. But with setting a zero carbon target, it means that every sector of the economy needs to drive towards net zero carbon. And that includes all buildings, both new and existing. So it's a major challenge we face. What was probably disappointing for the UK government was a month after they made these ambitious declarations and targets, was the Committee for Climate Change came out and reported they weren't on target to hit their 80% reduction, let alone the 100% reduction. So there's a significant challenge there for the UK government and governments globally. And what we've seen since that is we've seen governments and local authorities all around the world come out and make their similar declarations and aim to be net zero carbon by 2050, and in a number of cases actually earlier, even 2028, 2030, 2038, and they're really starting to try and understand what they need to do to hit those net zero carbon targets. So governments are really starting to be a driver for change. They're really going to be ramping up the pressure, and some of these are legally binding challenges. We've also seen this at local authority level, and wherever we're doing planning applications or designing new buildings, or actually even operating buildings, there's going to be more pressure going forward on achieving certain energy targets in order to meet the local authorities' requirements. It's not just been from the public sector, we've also seen this in the private sector, probably even more so in the private sector. So investors now are requiring organisations to meet strict corporate social responsibility requirements. In the built environment, that generally means conforming to standards like GRESB or the Task Force for Financial Disclosure. The Task Force for Financial Disclosure, for those of you who don't know, is a organisation set up by Mark Carney from the Bank of England to look at the risks of climate change adaptation and mitigation for organisations that they have to report both their risks and what they're doing about it in order to secure finance. This is now endorsed by all world banks and is chaired by Bloomberg. And going forward, we're expecting more and more investors to actually require developments to submit proposals in line with this in order to achieve funding. Banks like ING will only lend to organisations which now report against TCFD. So investors are really starting to take this seriously, and it's really starting to trickle through the industry. So we're seeing pressure really from the ground, but also from investment and the money. In terms of developers, we work with a number of developers around the world, and most of them have really taken this on board, and most of the Grade A developers we work with have submitted or signed up to the World Green Building Council or the Better Building Partnerships net zero carbon commitment, which requires them to make their businesses net zero carbon and the developments they work on over a period and set out route maps. A lot of those organisations are now setting out those route maps, and we're helping develop those with them. And finally, we're seeing it from occupiers and businesses. A lot of businesses are using the UN sustainability goals and climate change to set their corporate social responsibility, and they're realizing that their buildings that they occupy play a significant part in their carbon footprint. I'm working with a number of investors and landlords, and they're having tenants come to them and say they are thinking about moving unless the landlord can demonstrate that they're going to make the building net zero carbon or work towards net zero carbon. So you might have the best all singing or dancing building now, but if it's not on a pathway towards net zero carbon in the near future, it could become unlettable and reduce the asset value significantly. In terms of the built environment, what we've seen is really a combined effort globally around the World Green Building Council to set targets and aspirations for net zero carbon. They've set a roadmap out that all new buildings will be net zero carbon by 2030 and all existing buildings by 2050. And then all local green building councils have been defining what that actually means, setting up certification schemes. One of the longest running programs has been by the UK Green Building Council, which we've been heavily involved in. That was putting together a really detailed framework on what net zero carbon actually means. It came to the market late compared to a lot of the other green building councils, but it's been so well received. A lot of the other green building councils are now looking to it and copying it internationally. What that does is it really focuses on the upfront carbon associated with the construction of the building, so the embodied carbon with constructing the building and the construction activities themselves, as well as the operational energy that the building uses in its life. It doesn't at the moment look at repair, demolishment and demolition, but it is going to be expanded to do so in the future. And that's generally known as whole life carbon, and that's an area that Cundall have been looking at in a large amount of detail over the last couple of years, working with people like the GLA to set their standards in terms of whole life carbon. It covers both new and existing buildings, and it's a really simple framework, and it's really solid in what it does. It basically says you need to reduce your construction impacts, reduce your operational energy, increase your renewable supply, and then supply any remaining energy off-site from renewables. Then whatever's left, you offset that residual and try to reduce that offset over time. And the key part of that is public disclosure. So every year that needs to be publicly disclosed and third-party verified. And what they've been doing in the interim is trying to really fill in the gaps of this framework, which is putting the detail to what reduced construction impacts means and reduce operational energy. So setting hard and fast targets that you have to achieve before you can do that green energy purchase or offsetting. In terms of the energy intensity targets, the way that they've gone about setting energy intensity targets is a top-down approach. So this is an approach where we basically say, how much electricity do we currently use in the UK versus how much electricity can be generated from renewable sources. At the moment, we generate about a third of our electricity from renewables, and we probably are looking to double our renewable output over the next 30 years by 2050. But in order to be a net zero carbon country, we need to reduce our demand in order to match that generation capacity. So we really need to see about a 60% reduction in energy use in the UK. And that is across all sectors. And with a top-down approach, that's kind of been equally shared by sectors, and the built environment has to have that same level of reduction. And in reality, other sectors might find it harder to decarbonise, and the built environment may have to be a larger proportion of that and may have to actually reduce at a greater rate. Based on that, they've set a target, which I'm not going to go into masses of detail on the targets today, but it's basically 55 kilowatt hours per metre squared per year. We have to hit that target before you offset or buy green electricity. And in comparison, and most new buildings are operating around about 150, and most existing buildings are operating around about 200. So it's not a marginal gain. It's not 20, 30, 40% improvement. It's quartering the energy we use in buildings. So it means significant change in the way we actually go about doing this. At the same time, a number of organisations have been looking at a slightly different approach to working out the targets, which is a bottom-up approach. LETI is one of those organisations. They've set targets for commercial buildings, residential buildings and schools, which are all pretty much in line with the UK Green Building Council, but they did it slightly differently. What they did was they looked at the an energy efficient building and looked at the measures required to reduce it to what they considered to be the optimum performance, the best performance that is practically possible for a building by making improvements to the fabric, systems and internal loads. And again, they've come up with the same kind of number, that 55 kilowatt hours per metre squared for commercial buildings. There's also the RIBA challenge, which has set a number of targets around operational energy and embodied carbon. And again, they're both showing significant reductions. So current benchmarks, 200 for operational energy, down to 55 for the operational energy. Embodied carbon, most embodied carbon reports show buildings are around about 1,000 for the upfront carbon, and we need to basically be halving that down to 500. As you've probably noticed, these three frameworks are very aligned. That's no coincidence. A lot of the similar people have been working on all three to try and really get the industry aligned. We didn't want the industry to basically have a framework for net zero carbon and then have differing numbers and metrics and definitions. So there's been a lot of work gone into making sure that the industry is fully aligned and geared up, ready to go. And as of kind of the first couple of months of this year, we thought we had everything in place to move net zero carbon on and start driving it through the industry. And then suddenly this happened. And it's kind of thrown spanners in the works, and everything's kind of gone on pause, potentially. And we're just really trying to understand what the implications of COVID-19 are going to be to the net zero carbon and climate change. The whole world is really in lockdown. As I said, we're a global business. We've seen this. We saw this in Asia before we saw it in Europe, and we're just sitting back and watching the ramifications around the world at the moment. And you've all probably been watching the news on a daily basis. And over the last few weeks or months, we've really started to become experts at exponential curves. Before this happened, most people probably had never heard of an exponential curve or really understand what it is. But now we see them on a daily basis. We are starting to really understand what they mean and how difficult it is to take action to deal with them and reduce them. And I think most people now understand that when they see a curve like this, it is a crisis. There is another famous exponential curve, which we've been talking about for the last decade, which is obviously the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, which shows a similar steep level of increase. But what's really interesting is that global leaders are now happy to refer to climate change as a crisis or an emergency, and you regularly see them call it the greatest threat to humanity. But nobody's doing anything about it. No one has done anything about it. They've talked about it, but there's no action taken. Over the last 3 months with the COVID crisis, we've seen what action actually means. We've seen what the governments have to do in order to take action to address an exponential curve. But we haven't seen anything like that anywhere in the world for climate change. And what's interesting is people are starting to make the same comparison. So we need to really start to think about flattening the climate curve, the emissions curve, and really drive towards meeting the Paris targets, which is the safe level for our ecosystems globally. There have been some environmental benefits, short-term benefits. With COVID-19, we've obviously seen significant improvements globally in air quality. In India now, you can actually see the Himalayas, which have been hidden with smog probably for the last decade. In terms of wildlife, you've seen it re-wilding cities and wildlife moving into certain areas of different countries. And we've also seen the third largest ever reduction in CO2 as we've seen a complete lockdown in air travel, private travel, and a lot of industry go on halt. And we're expecting to see about a 5% reduction in CO2 emissions because of COVID-19. But just to put that in context, in order to hit the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees, over the next decade, we need a 7.6% reduction. So marginal gains and temporary gains are all well and good, but in order to achieve the Paris Agreement and be within safe limits of operating for the planet, we need complete societal transformation in order to get to those targets. If you think about us individually, we're all sitting in our homes working, still using fossil fuels in inefficient buildings, inefficient homes. When we go back to work, there will be more people home working, so we're going to have offices and businesses working at the same time, all using fossil fuels. So we really need to concentrate on our existing building stock in order to get those reductions, in order to hit these targets. This is all kind of, however, the calm before the financial storm for many. We've already seen the impact to the financial markets. We've had about a 30% reduction in global stocks over the last month and a half, and that is before we even go back from the lockdown. It's the biggest crash since the Wall Street crash, since the Great Depression. And that happened over a significant period of time, whereas this has been an extreme sharp impact. And going forward, we're probably going to see a significant decrease in the availability of capital at precisely the wrong time. In terms of unemployment, by the end of the year, most European countries could be in double figures. And in the US, it's projected to be as high as 20%. This graph is showing the people signing up in America to the unemployment benefits, which when they went into lockdown, went into their highest ever spike they've ever seen. So governments around the world are going to be looking to economic stimulus packages to help kickstart their recovery. But are they looking in the right direction? We need to make sure that the stimulus package is not only recovering the economy, but also making us more resilient to future crises, including the climate crisis. We believe that a Green New Deal is probably the best way to do that. Addressing climate change doesn't need to slow down the economy. It can be used to push it forward. If history is any indication, recovering from an economic disruption this large requires an equal spike in demand and production. Outside of war, climate change is probably the only thing which is large enough to provide such a stimulus. So now is the time for governments to take bold action to look to solve the climate crisis whilst recovering. This is an opportunity to create jobs, thousands of new green jobs around the world, and to be seen as leaders in the green revolution. Historically, in recession, a lot of governments don't look to green stimulus. During the 2008 crisis, financial crash, only 15% of the stimulus was directed towards sustainability green measures. But as we come out of lockdown, all areas of industry, all sectors, will be looking to the government for handouts. So we need, as the built environment and the sustainability lobbying groups, need to be at the front of that queue to make sure that we're relevant and seen as a viable solution for that stimulus package. What's happened historically, especially in developing nations, is people look to strip natural assets, look to prop up traditional industries, which can have detrimental impacts on the environment. We need to offer an alternative solution, a green solution. The market is ready, as I've outlined. We understand what we need to do for net zero carbon. We just need a little bit of support to make sure that it's moving in the right direction. So what Cundall were in place to do before the COVID-19, and we've been accelerating the process over the last few weeks, is really push on net zero carbon. We thought it was the key focus of the industry before this happened. And with this happening, we really, it's galvanized our thinking that climate change is the key area we need to focus on going forward. So we've produced our own steps to net zero carbon, which is heavily drawn from the UK GBC, LETI, and other international guides on net zero carbon. And it's a real focus on how we achieve it, both for new and existing buildings. I'm not going to go through in massive details. We've got other seminars which go through the 7 steps, but I'll just run you through the 7 principles. So the first principle is passive design, fabric first measures. And starting that is really making sure that we've got the best possible daylight. The best possible daylight doesn't mean as much daylight as possible. You can have too much daylight. We see too many fully glazed buildings around the world. We need to have targeted glazing where the blinds aren't down all the time. We're able to use natural daylight as much as possible, but not have too much solar gain. So it's really trying to get that balance between solar gain and daylighting, which is around about 40 to 50% of the facade being glazed, not 100%. We also need to start to think about natural ventilation. Most buildings are sealed because of air quality and acoustic issues in urban environments. As we move towards more electric vehicles and air quality improves, there is the potential for natural ventilation. This might not be for the entire year. We'd probably want to seal most buildings in winter for heat recovery. And again, in summer when it's extremely warm, we want to have the comfort cooling on. But for large portions of the year, all over the globe, we're able to use natural ventilation to remove heat gains when it's kind of 15 to 25 degrees outside. And only when it gets to extreme temperatures, seal the building and use energy to condition the spaces. We really need to be focusing on the fabric, so using passive house where appropriate, where not, just still using the same principles, so insulation, air tightness, thermal bridging, making sure that we design it right in the first place so it uses less energy. In terms of step 2, which is reducing operational energy demand and consumption, we really need to rethink the way we operate and use buildings. Most buildings, especially in Europe and Asia, we heat and cool the buildings to 22 degrees or 20 degrees and cool to 24 degrees, which means we overheat and overcool the spaces. We need to probably be cooling them less and heating them less and cooling them less, and giving occupants local solutions of how they can control their own comfort. Again, this all has to be driven from a stance that we will not reduce the quality of the space. It needs to maintain the quality and comfort that people are used to. We also need to take a realistic approach to sizing equipment and buildings. In most buildings, all of the systems, the heating and cooling, ventilation systems, are significantly oversized to meet unrealistic peak loads. So looking at what the current standard is in most areas and trying to reduce that is going to be vital to make sure that equipment is correctly sized and working efficiently. And one way to do that is to do detailed analysis of buildings, to use the Australian Neighbours scheme or the UK Design for Performance scheme to really look at how we close that performance gap, doing detailed simulation, using that to set controls and commissioning strategies, and then verifying the use of buildings. In the UK, for example, we only generally predict the energy consumption of less than 2% of buildings. And for those buildings, we don't generally do any verification to guarantee that they're going to achieve that level. We need to move to a system where we're predicting all energy use in buildings for all buildings and then verify it makes that performance standard. One of the most obvious things we need to do is remove our reliance on fossil fuels. So that's removing gas boilers. It's fairly simple for new buildings. We've already seen a move to heat pumps and 5th generation heat networks. This is much more difficult in existing buildings where 90% of the UK stock, 95% of the UK stock currently have gas boilers. They need to be replaced. Does that mean replacing the central plant, or does that mean going in and changing the entire heating system? These are the things which need to be reviewed for all buildings going forward. There's obviously a place for renewables, but we need to hit our energy intensity targets without renewables. So in order to be classed as net zero carbon, you must hit that 55 kilowatt hours per meter squared target without any on-site renewables. Then provide as much of that from on-site renewables using demand control with batteries or other storage technologies. Where you can't provide that on site, generally in urban environments, you need to look at renewable purchase agreements and buying green electricity, which can be difficult in certain areas of the world, especially the UK, which is one of the most problematic nations to buy green electricity. And then focus on the embodied carbon and whole life carbon as the operational energy reduces. And whole life carbon is both the upfront carbon associated with the extraction of materials, process, transportation to site, the site activities, but also its operation, the maintenance, refurbishments, the fit outs, the demolition. So we really need to be focusing on all carbon use. There is guidance out there which Cundall's helped produce. So the RIBA RICS guidance are really good guidance. The GLA have just published whole life carbon requirements for new developments. And in Hong Kong, we've produced a carbon assessment tool, which is being used by the entire industry to look at their upfront carbon on all developments. And we really need to be thinking about this as in terms of part of the circular economy. So how do we reuse materials at the end, designing for deconstruction and making it a circular process. And the final part, and probably one of the most important parts, is publicly disclosing performance annually. So we need to be transparent in this. We need to create a league table of buildings, both new and existing, so we can see where we are against our peers. And we need a industry-wide response to this. I've had quite a lot of client meetings over the last few weeks, and they all say that it's confusing with so many different standards on whole life carbon, net zero carbon. They want the industry to come together and have a one voice, one approach to carbon, and that is underway. There are groups being set up to look at that and drive that forward so that there is a unified approach to net zero carbon and whole life carbon, both in the UK and globally. That's for new buildings, and to be honest, new buildings isn't where the challenge is going to be. We have the methodologies, we have the frameworks. It shouldn't add costs, because when we are removing weights of materials and processes, we should be saving costs. The difficulty is going to be the existing assets. If money is drying up, it's going to be much harder to find the money to decarbonise existing portfolios and assets. And again, existing assets have the problem that they generally have sitting tenants, plant replacement schedules. So it's not a case of doing it all in one hit or one instance. So the first thing we need to do for existing assets is understand where they sit at the moment, what is their energy consumption, and then set a pathway down to the target of net zero carbon. And that pathway might be a 10-year pathway, it might be a 20-year pathway. It really depends on what the building is and how it's being used at the moment. But there are easy wins. The first thing to do would be target the natural gas and remove that, and then setting a pathway down to net zero carbon. And those measures need to be timetabled out. It won't be a simple case of do it all in one hit. That would be nice to do, but for most buildings, it will have to be a phased program of plant replacement, facade replacement, looking at lease agreements when tenants move out, installing openable windows which might not be able to be used from day one, but as air quality improves, they will be able to be used, and having a roadmap to be net zero carbon in the future. So this is where the real challenge will be over the next few decades. But as we've seen with the current crisis, the cost of inaction is greater than the cost of action. We're seeing the effects of climate change. We're seeing the effects of crises globally. The longer we leave this, the less action we take, the more this is going to cost us. We can use this as a benefit to aid in our recovery from COVID-19, or we can see it as a burden and potentially just push the problem down the line, and the problem will be bigger down the line. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. Have we got any questions, Johnny?
Lots of questions coming in, which is great to see. Let's start with the first, as Sam got that in quite early. To what extent do you think net zero carbon will be achieved through offsetting rather than improvement to construction and performance improvement? It's a good question to start with.
It's a really good question. Offsetting is quite a controversial topic at the moment, and there's a lot of talk around offsetting. And when the UK GBC framework first came out, it obviously didn't have the energy intensity targets or the embodied carbon targets. And a number of organisations worked out their carbon footprint and then just offset and claimed to be net zero carbon. But those buildings were fairly energy intensive buildings. And unfortunately, if everyone just does that, we will still be using fossil fuels. We will not be able to meet the Paris Agreement just using offsets. And getting credible offsets is extremely difficult. At the moment, we as an organisation use offsets, but we are looking at plans to improve the offsets we use. Finding viable, credible offsets is extremely difficult. There's a lot of offsets which don't deliver. There's a lot of reports saying that 80% of the cost that goes on offsets doesn't actually deliver any carbon benefits. So we see a role for offsetting, but it's not a silver bullet. That's why we really like the UK GBC framework, which is you have to achieve certain operational energy intensity targets, you have to achieve certain embodied carbon targets, and only then can you look at offsetting, and you must have a plan for reducing those going forward.
Very good. The next question that came in, can we really achieve operating buildings on 25% of current energy use?
Yes. We can, but it's not going to be easy. We're working on quite a lot of projects at the moment. We're in project teams where people have said they've done low energy buildings before, and that's true. We have done low energy buildings before, but they're not at the same level. It's not a case of a marginal gain. It's not a case of let's buy a slightly more efficient chiller or buy slightly more efficient facades, put a bit more insulation. We know how to design net zero carbon buildings, but the problem is we need to basically achieve every single intervention level. There are basically 50 to 60 things which need to be done to make a building net zero carbon. Historically, most projects will do maybe 5 or 6 of these. What we need is every project to do all of them. They need to consider the solar gain. They need to have efficient plant. They need to have efficient controls. They need to have some form of natural ventilation. They need to optimize daylighting. Not all buildings do this. If you're outside of an urban environment in a country park, it's generally fairly easy to do. The biggest challenge is in dense urban environments with deep plan buildings with poor air quality and poor acoustic quality around it. But what we can do there is set buildings up to be ready to be net zero carbon when the ambient conditions improve and when the grid does decarbonise in that country.
Good, and then probably following on from that, Ben Hunter from Silverstone Building Consultancy agreed with your point. Existing building stock is a big challenge. What are your thoughts on how best we tackle this?
It's a fundamental challenge. Like, we only replace 1% of the stock for new buildings, so 70 to 80% of the buildings we will be occupying in 2050 are already built. So we need to tackle this as urgently as possible. It's really difficult. It needs deep intervention. As I said, most engineering consultancies can go into a building and reduce the energy consumption by 20 to 30% just by playing with controls and set points. But we don't need marginal change. We need systems change. We need that quartering of energy consumption. And in order to do that, we need to go into each building and really look at it and understand how it's operating and how we can set a reduction pathway. I'm working with quite a lot of investment portfolios at the moment, and what we're doing is we're taking example buildings, going in, looking at every single measure that we can do, setting those roadmaps, so cladding replacement, facade replacement, plant replacement, and then using that as a strategy for multiple assets, because it's better to focus the attention on 1 or 2 buildings and use those as examples rather than do high level reviews of multiple buildings. So the ESOS scheme is very good that we've had in the UK, which requires people to look at the energy efficiency of the buildings, but it doesn't go into enough detail to get you to net zero carbon. What we need people to do is really focus, deep dive, understand how that building is really working, where the energy is being wasted, where the opportunities for improvement are, and then use those as exemplar projects going forward.
Okay. I think there's some confusion. People are sending in their questions. Only the panelists can see the questions if you're furiously looking at where the questions went. So I'm reading from these, but thank you. There are a lot of questions that come in, and we probably won't be able to get through all of them. So I'm trying to sort of group some of them together or pick out themes. So someone asked for a clarification. Could you develop on the 55 megawatt hour without renewables to be net zero carbon? Really interesting point that it would be good to understand more about to ensure passive designs are comprehensive from the outset.
So these are the energy intensity targets, which are building specific. I'm using 55, which is generally commercial offices. It's 55 kilowatt hours per meter squared. And what the standards from both LETI, UK GBC, and RIBA say is you must achieve this as the most energy you consume as a building from all the systems before you do green energy or offsetting. So that includes small power, lighting, M&E systems, HVAC systems. Every single system in the building has to be compliant. The UK GBC framework actually breaks it down, so it has landlord and tenanted energy. So you can have the breakdown and see what the difference between the two is and set targets, but you still need to be mindful of the overall energy consumption of the total building. In terms of residential, most people are talking about intensity targets of around about 35. Again, this is basically your metered reading. So if you basically go to your energy bill, divide it by your floor area, that is basically your target. So if most of you get your energy bill after this presentation for your house, I expect most of you will be over 100, not close to that 35, to show you the level of reduction you're going to need.
Okay, Cundall have a reputation for including health and well-being as a priority in projects. Can you say how these relate to the climate crisis?
Yeah, it's an extremely difficult challenge, and it's something that we look at in a lot of detail. There's a lot of focus on health and well-being, and as I said, what we want to do is make net zero carbon buildings which do not affect the quality of the space. And we've been doing a lot of research at the moment into how we can maintain comfort levels whilst changing set points. For example, in the UK, We use the British Council for Offices standards for heating and cooling, which is 21 and 24. But what we're looking to do is reduce that heating point and increase the cooling point up to 226 and see if we can maintain the same comfort levels. We can do this by air movement or local heating, which uses significantly less energy. So yes, it's a real problem, but there are solutions as long as you consider the two together. The problem is always when you have one organisation or group looking at health and well-being and another group or person looking at sustainability, and they're not looked at in tandem, is where you generally get wastage or underperformance. They need to be considered in a holistic approach and understand the implications of one to the other.
So you need a really good consultant that really understands all of them to be able to pull the whole thing together. Sorry, shameless plug. Right. How can we best shape the trajectory towards the new normal in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis? Is there anything that we should be recording and monitoring within the crisis that we are currently not, so that we can better learn from this storm? It was a thought-provoking question.
It's a really good question. I've actually listened to a few conferences in the last few weeks on where sustainability sits now in the global economy. COP26 was supposed to be sustainability's defining moment. The entire world's focus was generally on climate change before this happened. It was at the front of the agenda. That's not going to be the case. When we do COP26 next year, sustainability will not be the lead item. It will still be COVID-19. And what we need to do is adapt to this changing world and really work out how we can basically jump on the bandwagon or ride the wave of COVID-19 and show our relevance towards the public health crisis. Climate change needs to be part of the solution. It can't be seen as an alternative. There's going to be a lot of competing forces for the financial stimulus. We need to demonstrate the benefits of sustainability to the current pandemic and potential future pandemics. So again, with climate change, there's projections of huge displacement of people and creating significant poverty, which will lead to more public health issues. So we basically need to be amplifying these issues and saying, in order to make resilient communities going forward, we need to consider climate change to reduce the likelihood of these pandemics. So we just need to change the way we engage. And so the sustainability lobbying groups haven't been great at doing that. The oil and gas have been much better at lobbying government and getting their voice heard. We need to really think about how we communicate both externally to the mass media and the public, as well as how we communicate to government and policymakers. The policymakers are thinking about this. I've seen a number of think tanks talk about this and what they want to be doing about this going forward, but they need the public to really be pushing it as well, and it needs to be top of the agenda. So we really need to be communicating this as much as possible and using the right kind of language.
Very good. This is one that I know that we've discussed quite a lot internally within Cundall and with our clients. So how do you reconcile the requirement to minimise upfront embodied carbon with circularity, e.g. metals have high embodied but are also highly circular? Just keep you on your toes, Simon.
Going into detail, I need Chan here for the whole life carbon. Yeah, it's a really good point, and circularity is driving up massively on the agenda. The GLA have just published their circularity guidance, which we fed into the whole life carbon report. We need to be looking at buildings in their whole life, and the whole life. We need to be looking at whole life carbon and whole life cost at the same time, with an eye on circularity. For example, building a facade which has low embodied carbon, upfront carbon on day one, might need replacing every 30 years, whereas building a more energy or carbon intensive facade, which has a more durable lifestyle of up to 60 or 100 years, might be a better solution, especially if that can be demounted or deconstructed. So it needs to be thought about. I'm not going to give a simple answer for the individual systems, but it needs to be thought about in the whole. So it needs to be thinking about whole carbon, whole cost, and then end of use and end of life, which is extremely difficult to do. But what we're finding on projects is putting matrices together and tables to give the client the informed choice on what they do. If they make a decision, what does it mean to all of these variables, is going down particularly well with clients.
Another one to get your grey matter moving. People are obviously kind of clamoring for detail, so we are getting into a bit more detail on these. If we know how to design these super efficient buildings, do we have a clear idea on the cost of building these?
Yeah, this is the question that gets asked all the time. The cost for a new building shouldn't be higher in terms of actual build cost, because if you think about whole life carbon and embodied carbon, you're trying to reduce the use of materials, you're trying to reduce the weight of materials, you're trying to reduce the amount of materials you're using in the first place. So whenever our whole life carbon team and embodied carbon team are doing assessments, they will show the carbon saving, but they'll also show a material saving, which can be a cost saving. Similarly, in terms of HVAC and M&E systems, if we are currently oversizing all of our equipment to meet peak designs from standards like BCO or CIBSE or ASHRAE, which aren't ever seen in reality, we're oversizing equipment. We have too large heating systems, too large cooling systems, too large fan core units on the floors. If we're able to make these more efficient, they're going to be smaller and cheaper. So there are savings as well. There are big issues around net lettable. Most buildings that we generally look at are too deep and they struggle to be naturally ventilated or get sufficient daylight. So you might have to think about your net lettable loss. That's where the cost loss generally is. The actual build cost should be the same or cheaper. The loss is the economic viability of some sites, and that's what we really need to focus on. The big problem, again, as I said, is the existing buildings where there isn't generally a big pot of money for shiny new buildings. If you're doing a major refurbishment, you generally have the money, but the problem is where you don't have any money, you have sitting tenants, you have a building which is operating, you don't have any forecast for improving that, but you're going to need to. And what you need to look at there is the financial risks. So you might have a building which is a fairly good asset now, but will that asset be valuable in 5, 10, 20 years' time? As I've said, investors are really looking for the sustainability credentials. I work with a number of pension and hedge funds, and they are looking to procure buildings which only achieve certain energy performance ratings or certain international sustainability standards. So you won't be able to sell or get investment for these buildings. Tenants won't be attracted to them, or you will be penalised by local or central government because you've still got your gas boilers on. So there are economic penalties associated with running poor buildings, which will be coming in the next decade.
Thanks, Simon. We're running out of time, and you've done a sterling job, so we'll probably just do see if we can do one or two more. Another one about the sort of future flexibility. So should future flexibility be an inherent design requirement? For example, whilst designing as an office building, whilst designed as an office building, but be flexible to be converted into other uses at a later date, i.e. resi hotel, to maximise its potential lifespan?
Yes, definitely. This is an area we're looking at on quite a lot of schemes at the moment. Again, it comes down to the life of buildings. We've generally been building for the last, 40, 50 years, buildings which have a single purpose, and then we're seeing those knocked down. The buildings which are generally lasting are more adaptable. Some buildings in urban environments have been there for hundreds of years because they are adaptable. We need to design buildings which are adaptable to save the embodied carbon. So again, it might be worth investing more upfront carbon in order to reduce the whole life carbon to ensure that the building is reusable. So again, looking at floor to ceiling heights, loadings is important, but don't massively over engineer and oversize. We need to be realistic about what is feasible going forward and what future loadings might be. So flexibility is huge on most clients' aspirations, and it needs to be considered.
Okay, we'll just squeeze in one more. Are there any clients delivering these exemplars so we know this is possible?
I'd say most major developers are now looking at it. In terms of Australia have been using the Neighbours scheme for over a decade now and have seen 70% reductions. They are achieving buildings which are achieving these energy intensity values. In the UK, we've just brought in Design for Performance, which Cundall are a pioneer and partner for, and we are the auditing review organisation for doing the peer reviews. And there's a lot of the big developers doing pilot schemes against this. They're generally not into the energy intensity because they are still using traditional UK design methodologies. but they're seeing where the energy wastage or intensity is. So we are seeing projects move towards these targets, not hitting these targets yet, but it's taking step change. And it's again about visibility. It's about seeing where the carbon is actually being used and then saying, do we really need that? We're working on a major office fit out at the moment where they wanted to achieve the net zero carbon contribution. And they were, when we did the analysis, we were 3 times the energy intensity target. We managed to get that to twice the energy intensity target. And then we had to have frank discussions. Did they really need kitchens? Do they need their own catering? Do they need their own data centers? Do they need their own gyms? All these things are generally, if they're outsourced, are done more efficiently than doing them in-house. So it's really starting, we're only really starting this journey in Asia and Europe. Australia generally is ahead on these things, and we really need to focus on understanding where the energy use sits. Again, if you want to look for exemplar projects, Scandinavia are hitting these intensity targets and upfront carbon targets. Again, they're not building as high as we are or as dense as we are, but they are able to hit these targets.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. That takes us to our hour. Thank you very much for those of you joining us, as I say, across the world for the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and as Simon said, the 5th anniversary of the Paris Accord. And in these tough times, obviously, we hope everyone stays safe, and then we can all work together to overcome the climate crisis. If you want any more information, please contact those that you know at Cundall, or myself or Simon. We will be sharing the recording of this with you all later today. And yeah, just from all of us, have a great rest of the day, and we look forward to working with you in the future.